a death sentence from their own brass for the intentional destruction of government property. That was the reward waiting for these heroes. Choking on carbon monoxide, the doomed tankers secretly assembled something found in no field manual. A two-headed steel freak that defied every basic law of structural mechanics. For this engineering insanity, they faced a firing squad. Yet it was this very hunk of scrap metal that incinerated 23 German machines. You won't believe the gruesome meat grinder this decommissioned monstrosity unleashed once its creators decided to spit on the regulations. Red-hot shrapnel shears through a driver's skull as easily as a German armor-piercing shell rips through the side plating of a light tank. The air instantly fills with the stench of scorched rubber, burnt human flesh, and the acrid tang of TNT. With a hollow roar, the earth rears up, turning into leaden mud raining from the sky. Summer 1944, Western Ukraine. A sudden artillery strike from heavy enemy batteries hammers a field repair battalion, turning a park of damaged armor into a smoking mass grave. The enemy's heavy howitzers grind metal, tools, and men into a uniform pulp with the cold precision of an accountant. At the very epicenter of this localized annihilation lies a graveyard of light tanks. The T-70 series was built during the lean years to support advancing infantry, but the merciless front had long since dictated different, far more brutal conditions. Light armor was thrown into the slaughter against heavy steel beasts born of German engineering. 35 millimeters of frontal armor, sloped at a rational angle, gave the crew only a ghost of a chance against older anti-tank guns. But the harsh reality of 1944 left no room for illusions. The long-barreled 75 millimeter of a German Panther or the terrifying 88mm flak gun adapted for the Tiger tanks simply didn't notice the obstacle.
A heavy armor-piercing slug would punch straight through the light tank, shear the turret from its race, and instantly detonate the stowed ammo rack. A tanker's survival depended entirely on top speed, a low silhouette, and maneuverability over broken ground. Upon a direct hit, the tank turned into a white-hot furnace in a fraction of a second, vaporizing human lives without a trace. The ground shudders from a new, even closer impact. The shockwave violently hurls heavy clods of clay onto the torn armor of a mangled hull. Beneath the belly of a wrecked machine, in a fuel-soaked crater, 2 men lie low. Sergeant Major Kolchin hoarsely spits out dust mixed with blood. His face is pitch black from ground-in soot. His calloused hands are permanently stained with oily sweat and rust. Beside him, gasping for air, a miraculously surviving mechanic breathes heavily. The concentration of carbon monoxide from nearby burning rubber cuts into his lungs like broken glass. A relentless, piercing ringing in their ears partially drowns out the screams of wounded comrades. The physiology of survival under fire is brutally simple. Press into the saving mud, merge with the terrain, turn to stone, and just wait for the shelling to stop. But the Sergeant Major's brain is working at a completely different tempo. Ordinary animal fear had burned away in dozens of previous engagements. Inside, nothing remained but a ringing void, icy, concentrated fury, and honed professional reflexes. Through the acrid smoke, Kolchin's inflamed eyes lock onto scattered details of the landscape. An angular turret with a 45mm gun, ripped off by an explosion, lies 5 meters away, half buried in the dirt. Slightly to the left, another destroyed light tank smolders. Its turret is perfectly intact, but its engine compartment has been shredded to ribbons. 2 dead machines, 2 useless hunks of iron against the backdrop of a looming catastrophe.
Engines trashed, crankcases pierced. The mechanic rasps, his trembling hands bandaging a deep gash on his forearm.
The rig's a write-off. It's just scrap metal now.
The running gear is completely intact, Colchin answers dryly, without a hint of emotion, his gaze fixed on the two wrecked hulls. Torsion bars are fine. Will the transmission hold a critical overload?
What overload, Sergeant Major? The battalion's been blown to hell.
2 turrets on 1 working chassis. The mechanic freezes, forgetting to tighten the knot on his bandage. The throbbing pain in his arm instantly recedes before the terrifying scale of the voiced madness. The frame will snap at the welds. The twin gas automotive engines physically can't pull the weight of 2 armored caps. 70 horsepower per motor, Sergeant Major. That's a stationary coffin for the crew. It's necessary fire density, Colchin cuts him off harshly. A single 45 won't take the frontal armor of a heavy Kraut. 2 guns, firing in sync into a vulnerable flank from an ambush. That's a guaranteed penetration and burn. We start cutting the turret mounts as soon as this dust settles. War in its true form is the ruthless mathematics of lethality and the ultimate load-bearing capacity of machinery. A standard light tank weighed about 10 tons. An additional welded turret with its breech, heavy ammo load, frontal shielding, and bulky hand-cranked traverse mechanisms added a critical weight never intended by the designers. The center of gravity would inevitably shift upward. The independent torsion bar suspension was doomed to operate far beyond the metal's yield strength. The road wheels would be ground to dust during maneuvers. The twin-engine setup would howl agonizingly at redline, choking on its own boiling oil from inevitable overheating. The idea completely contradicted every basic law of structural mechanics and elementary common sense. But engineering textbooks didn't save anyone from German armor-piercing shells. The absolute vulnerability of light armor pushed survivors toward the most radical, suicidal measures. Grafting 2 destroyed wrecks into a single 2-headed steel monster seemed like the blatant manic delusion of a shell-shocked man. However, in the brutal conditions of a total lack of anti-tank firepower on this sector of the front, this engineering insanity became the only real chance to cheat imminent death and deal the enemy a blow. The heavy artillery fire gradually tapers off, leaving behind nothing but ringing ears and the crackle of burning wood. Thick grey dust slowly settles, revealing a mangled field ploughed by craters. The repair battalion was short a third of its strength after those 15 minutes of annihilation. Deep craters smoke and cool all around. Colchin struggles out from under the pierced belly of the tank. The muscles of his exhausted back cramp painfully from the long static tension on the cold ground. The despair of daily life at the front crystallizes into a clear objective. A grueling, illegal assembly lies ahead. A harsh engineering solution to an absolutely impossible task, where the blueprints would be the tanker's sharpened instincts, and the primary tools would be a heavy sledgehammer, a steel crowbar, taut cables, and hand winches. This wouldn't just be a repair, it would be a brutal engineering duel that dared to challenge not only relentless physics, but also a strict military tribunal for the destruction of government property. Creating this steel Frankenstein would require the entire coming night, extreme muscular strain, and kilograms of scarce welding electrodes, their treacherous showers of sparks hidden from enemy bombers under the cover of darkness. Darkness descends upon the battered repair battalion like a heavy, stifling shroud. Light discipline is the absolute law of survival. German bombers continuously patrol the grid, hunting for the slightest sign of life. One careless beam of light, one stray shower of sparks from a welder, and a merciless firestorm would immediately rain from the heavens. But on the wrecked lot, safely hidden in a deep ravine, a far more dangerous conspiracy is brewing. A conspiracy against the strictest army regulations, against the laws of mechanics, and against the all-powerful military bureaucracy. The regimental commander's order had been crystal clear. Immediately write off the mangled machines as total losses. Assembling unauthorized designs from scrap metal is strictly defined as sabotage under wartime law. A swift execution before the ranks for the intentional destruction of state property. That was the only guaranteed reward for failing this venture. But the fear of a tribunal pales before the fear of burning alive in a weak machine during the next frontal assault. The turret of a light tank, with its 45mm gun, heavy ammo load, traverse gears, and optics, weighs over a ton. Lifting this monolithic slab of cold steel without a specialized repair crane is a task beyond human capability. The crew of 4 exhausted men turns into a single living winch. Muscles creak, tendons stretch to the limit, threatening to snap at any second under the monstrous weight of the iron. Strained backs burn with unbearable fire. Tools are critically scarce. They resort to ordinary wooden logs, thick crowbars, and a system of makeshift pulleys. "Heave on the winch! Get more leverage!" Kolchin rasps through gritted teeth. His boots slide on the blood and oil-soaked earth, finding no solid footing. "The cable's snapping, Sergeant Major. My veins are popping!" The mechanic groans hollowly. He winds the thick steel rope onto an improvised windlass, physically feeling the coarse metal strip the skin off his palms down to the raw meat. "Hold it steady. If it slips, it'll crush us all to hell. Come on, another half-meter."
"Lock the teeth with the crowbar."
Metal grinds against metal with a sickening screech. The sound cuts through eardrums worse than nearby shrapnel. Dozens of meters of steel cable are pulled taut as piano wire. A ton of armored steel, slowly, millimeter by millimeter, lifts off the ground. Every careless move carries a 100% risk of being crushed to death by a falling turret. War does not tolerate the weak, and physics knows no mercy. The light machine's center of gravity shifts critically high. To mount the second turret next to the first on a single, narrow hull, they have to ruthlessly cut away part of the fenders with a gas torch. The hull's load-bearing frame is inevitably weakened, violating the structural integrity of the design. The air is thick with the acrid smell of burnt steel, sour sweat, and spilled antifreeze. The arc welding begins. This is the most lethally dangerous stage of the entire night operation. The bright light of a welding arc in pitch darkness is a perfect target for enemy night aviation. The mechanics tightly cover the machine's hull with layers of greasy tarpaulin, creating a stifling, oxygen-deprived insulator. Inside this improvised black tent, the temperature instantly skyrockets to an unbearable level. The men choke on the thick, toxic smoke of melting electrodes. The concentration of carbon monoxide ruthlessly corrodes their lungs, forcing them to cough until they are nauseous. "Electrodes are running out. The bead will warp because of the temperature drop." The welder breathes heavily. He blindly guides the holder over the blindingly hot metal, squinting through the cracked, dark glass of his mask. "Weld it in 2 passes. Reinforce it with thick steel angle iron. If the recoil rips the turret off during a shot, our own people will put us against the wall before dawn." Kolchin cuts him off. He wipes streams of stinging sweat from his eyes with an incredibly filthy rag. "Done. Drop the ground."
Let me get some air.
The twin-engine setup of 2 car motors groans and sags under the unintended static load. The original torsion bars bend almost to the limit, completely losing their dampening elasticity. The thin 35mm frontal armor plate now carries double the mass. The Sergeant Major's engineering calculation is brutally simple. The overloaded running gear will fail very quickly. The twin engines will inevitably seize from extreme oil overheating. But this machine must manage to fire its main simultaneous volley. 2 45mm guns, rigidly aimed at one specific point. The double hit of kinetic energy is capable of punching through the flank of a heavy German armored vehicle.
This is no longer a mass-produced light tank. It is a custom steel scalpel, specifically designed solely for a suicidal short-range ambush. The night melts away slowly and reluctantly. Through the holes in the scorched tarpaulin, a gray, cold dawn timidly breaks. The machine takes on its ugly, jagged silhouette. Two turrets sit side by side on a single cramped ring. The suspension clanks loudly and plaintively at the slightest rocking of the overloaded hull. Inside the fighting compartment, an unbearable crampedness reigns. There is practically no room left for the loaders to work. Every movement inside has to be calculated down to the centimeter to avoid being maimed by the heavy gun breaches during the inevitable recoil. The ammo has to be stowed right under their feet, in blatant defiance of all safety regulations. 80 fixed rounds, packed tightly in the cramped space, turn the tank into a detonating bomb. A direct hit from even a small fragment into this rack would leave nothing of the crew but charred bone fragments. The crew collapses from extreme muscular exhaustion. Torn blisters on their hands bleed, leaving rusty marks on the cold metal of the guns. Their uniforms are stiff with dried mud and motor oil. The work is finished. The machine is assembled in defiance of strict orders, in defiance of the laws of structural mechanics, and in defiance of the instinct for self-preservation. Secrecy cannot last forever in a forest teeming with troops. The noise of cutting metal and the dull, heavy thuds of sledgehammers could not go unnoticed in the front-line zone. The inevitable reckoning for their engineering audacity is already fast approaching from the direction of the HQ dugouts. The hardest part remains, starting the overloaded motors and moving this ugly monster away from prying eyes into a deep ravine. And it is there, among the damp clay slopes, that their future fate will be decided. The damp clay slopes of the deep ravine reliably muffled the strained howl of the overloaded engines, but they could do nothing to hide the dry, metallic clack of assault rifle bolts being racked. The secret of the illegal night assembly collapsed at dawn. Captain Rogov, head of the battalion's special section, descended quickly into the hollow, closely escorted by submachine gunners from a blocking detachment. The heavy, hobnailed boots of the escort churned the wet morning earth with a squelch. The captain's face remained absolutely inscrutable, like a mask carved from gray stone. In the harsh conditions of a total armor shortage, any unauthorized tampering with the factory design of a combat vehicle was classified by a military tribunal solely as intentional sabotage. The field court worked with extreme speed, without unnecessary paperwork, lawyers, or long deliberations. The firing squad, out of habit and on autopilot, fanned out around the perimeter of the camouflage netting. "Shut down the engines immediately," Rogov commanded dryly, his right hand resting carelessly on the worn wooden holster of his Mauser. "Crew, egress the fighting compartment. You are going before a tribunal for the intentional destruction of entrusted state property." Kolchin slowly wiped his soot-blackened hands with an oily rag. Arguing with a man who had a direct command order and a dozen cocked barrels behind his back was utterly pointless. The air at the bottom of the ravine suddenly became thick, cold, and sticky. A dead, crushing silence hammered against their eardrums, significantly harder than yesterday's artillery barrage. The physiology of animal fear began its usual mechanical work. Icy sweat poured down tensed spines. Adrenaline hit the bloodstream with a powerful surge, narrowing peripheral vision into a tight tactical tunnel. The exhausted crew lined up silently by the overloaded tracks of their ugly steel creation, waiting for the inevitable, logical finale. The first chill of morning dew touched the cold metal of the hatch covers. This viscous, deadly silence was suddenly shattered by a long machine gun burst. Then another, denser one followed immediately. From above, from the direction of the thick forest, glowing tracers hammered down. A sudden, aggressive breakthrough by a German motorized Kampfgruppe.
The enemy had come out exactly on the weakly defended flank of the repair battalion's park. Rogov's riflemen instantly dropped into the saving mud. The earth around them began to erupt in sharp fountains from the impacts of heavy-caliber bullets. A heavy German machine gun methodically mowed down thick brush with lead, spitting out 1,200 deaths every minute. Through the thinning morning mist, the angular, predatory silhouette of an enemy half-track emerged clearly. 14 millimeters of sloped Krupp armor made it absolutely invulnerable to the light, small arms of the pinned-down blocking detachment. "Into the machine!" Rogov screamed in a voice not his own, cracked and desperate, as he pressed into the liquid clay under a blistering crossfire. "Destroy the target! If this heap of iron falls apart, I'll shoot you myself!" Reflexes hammered in by months of combat kicked in much faster than conscious thought. The tankers lunged into the cramped, sweltering gut of the tank. The compressed fighting compartment met the men with the stifling, stale stench of old gunpowder and spilled fuel oil. The two twin-car engines coughed blue smoke and howled agonizingly at their red line. The overloaded running gear clanked heavily with a screech. The tank turned in place slowly, with immense effort. Every movement of the steel tracks was achieved with colossal difficulty. The excess weight of two heavy turrets pressed the road wheels deep into the soft, yielding soil of the ravine. "Load armor piercing! Both guns!" Kolchin barked, pressing an inflamed eye to the narrow slit of the optical sight. "Right side ready! Left side ready!" The loaders responded in perfect sync, in a single breath, slamming the fixed rounds into the breeches. The clack of the sliding block breeches merged into one sharp, metallic snap. The direct fire range was exactly 300 meters. The enemy half-track continued to drench the ravine in hot lead. A standard shot from a single light gun might have resulted in a useless ricochet off the sloped frontal plate of the enemy vehicle, but Kolchin's engineering concept didn't account for chance. It demanded immediate, bloody confirmation. Two barrels, rigidly zeroed to a single point of aim. A double, focused kinetic strike, guaranteed to shatter armor. "Fire!" The ravine shuddered to its foundations. The simultaneous volley from two guns practically ruptured their eardrums. A plume of blinding flame roared from the muzzles. The monstrous recoil of two guns hitting at once slammed mercilessly into the tank's light hull. The overloaded welded chassis let out a long groan. The rear road wheels momentarily lifted off the ground. The crew was hurled violently against the cold metal inside the cramped turrets. The air in the fighting compartment burned out instantly, replaced entirely by acrid, eye and throat-searing propellant gas. The machine didn't fall apart. The crude welds held against the monstrous dynamic stress. The shells landed perfectly. Two 45mm steel slugs hit the half-track's frontal armor in sync. The first shell deeply crumpled the steel plate, punching a critical breach. The second shell entered exactly into the resulting hot fracture, shredding the engine and detonating the enemy's internal ammo load. The enemy vehicle instantly turned into a blinding, roaring fireball. Captain Rogov rose heavily from the mud, shaking off his shrapnel-torn greatcoat. The tribunal had been cancelled by the physics of war itself. The harsh scrap metal had proven its right to kill. "Start the engines, Sergeant Major." The captain spat through his teeth. "We're moving to HQ. We're going to get your machine on the manifest." The twin engine howled again. Ahead lay the long road to the HQ dugouts, where harsh frontline realities would inevitably collide with the cold indifference of paper instructions. The HQ dugouts greet the crew with the musty smell of damp wood, cheap tobacco, and spilled ink. This smell contrasts sharply with the sour tang of old gunpowder and burnt rubber from the fighting compartment, which has permanently soaked into the tankers' uniforms. On the horizon, rhythmically, at exactly 40-second intervals,
Heavy German 150mm howitzers thump dully. The earth shudders steadily, shaking fine yellow sand from the thick log ceiling directly onto neatly laid out topographical maps. Inside, a cold, methodical kingdom of military bureaucracy reigns. Major Bereznev sits at a crudely built table. His officer's tunic is perfectly laundered. His collar is impeccably white. War in this cramped space is measured not in liters of spilled human blood or kilograms of burnt explosive, but solely in dry lines of orders, numbered write-off forms, and endless charts of irrecoverable losses in personnel and equipment. To a desk jockey, frontline reality is merely an ordered set of statistical data.
The heavy oak armored door of the bunker reliably cuts him off from the screams of the dying in the field hospital and the strained clatter of overloaded tracks. Bereznev slowly flips through the thick, yellowish pages of a service record. A sharp graphite pencil in his clean fingers methodically strikes out serial numbers of engines and components. According to official documents, the machine is listed as destroyed, the major states in an absolutely flat voice, devoid of the slightest emotion. A direct hit from a 105mm high-explosive shell to the engine transmission compartment is recorded. The scrap write-off was approved by Front Command yesterday at exactly 1900 hours. Regulations do not provide for the resurrection of destroyed property. The machine is fully operational, Comrade Major. Sergeant Major Kolchin answers hollowly through tightly gritted teeth. His shell-shocked ears continue to ring painfully with a high frequency after the morning's simultaneous volley in the ravine. His mangled back aches from the monstrous overexertion of the night assembly. The running gear is fully functional. 2 rifled 45mm barrels provide the necessary fire density to guarantee penetration of a medium enemy tank from an ambush. We incinerated an enemy half-track less than an hour ago. The Major's pencil snaps, the jagged lead tearing through the thin paper. Bereznev slowly raises a cold, unblinking stare at the Sergeant Major, whose face is blackened by ingrained oil and soot. 2 worlds collide in a ringing silence, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thud of shells impacting the front lines. Field expedient engineering is strictly forbidden by Armored Corps regulations, the Major barks, slamming his open palm onto the desk. The curb weight of a light tank is exactly 9,800 kilograms. You took it upon yourself to install a second turret weighing over a ton. You've butchered the vehicle's center of gravity. Ground pressure has exceeded every conceivable limit. The stock torsion bars will snap on the first march. Those twin engines will seize from oil starvation within 3 kilometers of continuous operation. This isn't a combat unit, Sergeant Major. It's a rolling iron coffin. You are gambling with the lives of your men. It's the only real chance our infantry has to survive a massed tank assault, Captain Rogov interjects, stepping toward the desk. The 35mm glacis plate can't take a direct hit from the enemy's heavy, long-barreled guns. Maneuverability and speed don't save us from shrapnel anymore. Only superior firepower does. A double tap of armor-piercing rounds hitting the same spot punches right through Krupp steel. We've proven it in the field. But concrete bureaucratic skepticism is immune to common sense. The machine doesn't recognize ingenuity. Technical manuals are written in the blood of past mistakes, but they are read by men who only see that blood as red ink on casualty reports. To Major Bereznev, this weld-scarred steel Frankenstein isn't a desperate weapon of vengeance. It's a gross violation of Form 32. It's an unauthorized modification that guarantees a gruesome death for the crew and a court-martial for the officer who allowed faulty equipment onto the line. The project is terminated immediately. Bereznev cuts him off, scrawling a jagged signature on the disposal order. Strip the vehicle by sunset. Dismount the rifled barrels and turn them into the ordnance depot. Send the hull to the railhead for scrap. The crew is to surrender their sidearms and return to the rear reserve for standard-issue replacements. Carry out the order immediately. No discussion. Kolchin feels a dull, helpless soldier's rage boiling in his chest. It burns hotter than toxic exhaust. A sleepless night of back-breaking labor under the threat of air raids. Hands rubbed raw and bloody. The risk of facing a firing squad. Their first hard-won victory in that clay ravine. All of it erased by a graphite pencil. A tank capable of killing the enemy has been sentenced to an ignominious death by its own rear echelon command. The death warrant wasn't signed by a German shell, but by an indifferent, blind staff circular. A heavy, suffocating silence hangs in the low-ceilinged bunker. Tired men stare at each other. The mechanics of military discipline break a man's will more effectively than a sledgehammer. Challenging a direct order in wartime is both impossible and suicidal. Kolchin turns on his heel, every movement a struggle. His cramped muscles feel like lead. The crew walks out of the stifling dugout into a gray sky choked with cordite smoke. Outside, the constant roar of total war greets them. But the distant rumble grows louder, denser, and more distinct by the minute. The damp earth vibrates with a new, terrifying frequency. This isn't the rhythmic thud of long-range artillery. It's the continuous, ominous growl of heavy, high-displacement engines. The unmistakable metallic clatter of wide steel tracks kills any thought of rest. The sticky scent of panic fills the air. Red flares burst nervously in the distance. Machine guns chatter. The front line shatters under a massive assault, and death rushes into the defenseless rear, where the engines of the condemned two-headed monster are still cooling. At that moment, Lieutenant Gromov screams into the HQ compound in a shrapnel-riddled scout car. The battered scout car tears into the scrapyard at high speed, brakes shrieking. A cloud of scalding steam hisses from the punctured radiator. The thin armor is peppered with dents from 7.92mm armor-piercing rounds. Lieutenant Gromov tumbles out of the narrow door onto the dusty ground. His faded tunic is soaked with the sticky blood of his dead driver. His face is a mask of road grime and acrid powder soot. A suffocating wave of low-frequency sound follows the scout car. The line is breached. German Panthers are methodically grinding through the defenseless rear. 45 tons of Krupp steel on wide tracks are turning the rear positions into a bloodbath. Their 75mm long-barreled guns are sniping medical convoys and ammo dumps. The 80mm sloped glacis of these monsters is invulnerable to light field guns. AP shells just ricochet off, throwing useless sparks. The mechanics of death are flawless. One HE shell turns a wooden truck into a fireball of gasoline and splinters. Gromov stares blankly at the rows of twisted, dead metal. His tank company was incinerated 40 minutes ago. Animal fear has been replaced by an icy void and a manic thirst for revenge. His eyes lock onto the ugly, angular silhouette with the two faceted turrets. Beside the cooling tracks of the condemned machine stands the shell-shocked Sergeant Major Kolchin. "Start the engines, Sergeant Major," Gromov rasps, spitting a glob of black phlegm onto his boot. "The Germans broke through the southern flank. They're cutting us to pieces. There are no reserves." "The vehicle was officially scrapped by Major Bereznev 30 minutes ago," Kolchin replies flatly, wiping his hands with an oily rag. "Orders are to strip the guns and dispose of it. To hell with the paperwork. My men are burning alive a mile from here. Crank this coffin before we get flattened right here." Defying a direct written order means a firing squad. Stealing scrapped equipment is a court-martial with no appeal. But cold fury for dead comrades
outweighs any fear of bureaucracy. Kolchin nods to the driver, his jaw clenched tight. Two gas engines choke on low-octane gas, belching thick blue smoke and screaming at the limit of their 70 horsepower. The starter hits the flywheel with a sickening metallic grind. The overloaded chassis sags. The torsion bars bend to the breaking point, threatening to snap under the uncalculated pressure.
The 10-ton hull, crushed by an extra ton of jury-rigged armor and the heavy breech of a second 45mm gun, shudders with a bone-jarring vibration. A sentry stumbles out of the guard shack, face twisted in terror, fumbling with his rifle. "Halt! I'll shoot! Orders from HQ!" the soldier screams, racking the bolt. Gromov doesn't even look at him. He leaps onto the scalding engine deck and slams the heavy steel commander's hatch shut. "Driver, floor it! Through the fence!" the command crackles over the intercom. Heavy steel tracks tear into the dry earth with a hideous screech. The overloaded transmission groans, the gears howling under the strain. The armored nose smashes through the thick logs of the checkpoint. Splinters fly. The paper death warrant is obliterated by raw kinetic energy. The machine bursts out of the perimeter, leaving nothing but a thick cloud of acrid dust. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, it's pure hell. Space is non-existent, the volume eaten up by 2 breaches and an illegal amount of ammo. 80 fixed rounds are wedged between the hot hull walls and the loader's legs. The temperature climbs toward 140 degrees. The suffocating smell of boiling oil mixes with the sour stench of spent powder. Every jolt sends a dull pain through their strained backs. The crew's physiology is slave to one ruthless mechanical rhythm. "A pee in both tubes," Kolchin dictates, pressing his eye to the narrow optic. The rubber eye cup bites into his brow. "Engagement range, point blank. We hit the flank. Only the flank." The tank hurtles toward the roar of battle, eating through the remaining life of its worn-out engines. The bulky, unbalanced machine lurches on the dirt road. Every pothole sends a tooth-rattling jar through the metal. The right engine begins to sputter, but the driver keeps the pedal pinned to the floor. The coolant temp hits the boiling point. This isn't a march, it's a suicide run. Fear is gone. The crippled machine is going to kill the perfect creations of German engineering. The road leads into a dense pine forest, beyond which lies the smoking wreckage of a destroyed column. The 2-turreted Phantom stops in the thick brush, ready for its surgical strike. The dense pine forest hides the weld-scarred silhouette. The overloaded gas engines are throttled down to a rough idle. The heavy, ragged breathing of 4 men inside the stifling iron box merges with the dull thud of worn valves. Through the narrow vision slits, the crew watches the German column. The enemy armor rolls carelessly onto the narrow dirt road, pinned between a swamp and a steep wooded hill. Medium tanks lead the way. Their 30mm side armor is vulnerable if hit at a right angle from short range. Long half-tracks packed with panzer grenadiers bring up the rear. The enemy is arrogant, confident after their breakthrough. Their optics are pointed forward, ignoring the quiet undergrowth on their right flank. Gromov's plan is based on cold physics and the brutal tactic of surprise. A Soviet 45mm AP slug weighs just over 3 pounds. At 300 yards, it has enough kinetic energy to punch through 40mm of Krupp steel. A single shot risks a ricochet or insufficient behind armor damage. But right now, 2 rifled barrels, locked onto a single turret ring, are staring at the vulnerable flank. "Range, 250. Lead vehicle, aim for the turret ring. AP," Kolchin barks, pressing into the rubber eye cup. Sweat stings his eyes, but he doesn't blink. "Left ready," the first loader rasps, slamming a shell into the breech. "Right ready," the second echoes, the steel wedge lock snapping shut. "Fire!" The forest edge shudders from a deafening, rolling double crack. The massive recoil of the twin guns slams into the light tank's hull, making the raw welds groan. 2 AP shells streak toward the target a tenth of a second apart. The first shell screams through the German tank's side armor, creating a zone of critical structural stress. The second shell hammers into that exact weakened white-hot spot, punching through and detonating the ammo rack. The multi-ton enemy turret is blown off its ring with a hideous screech, vomiting a pillar of blinding yellow flame into the gray sky. Animal chaos erupts in the German column. The other crews have no idea where the threat is coming from. German optics pick up dense, paired fire from the woods. Tank commanders scream over the radio about a massed ambush by an anti-tank battery or a group of heavy Soviet tanks. No manual covers a single light tank putting out this kind of fire. Drivers yank their steering levers, trying to turn their thick noses toward the invisible enemy, but the narrow road blocks them. Wide tracks churn uselessly in the swampy mud. Inside the steel Frankenstein, the crew works at the absolute limit of human endurance. The air hits 120 degrees. Thick powder gas burns their lungs. Second target, rear half track, AP. Ready? Ready. On the way. 2 empty, scalding brass casings clatter onto the floor. Another enemy vehicle becomes a roaring torch. Shrapnel shreds canvas and German flesh. Third target, center of the column, tank with the cross. Fire! The thin barrels glow dull red. The paint on the breeches bubbles, reeking of burnt chemicals. The loaders work with bloody hands, grabbing slippery shells on pure instinct. Every movement is calculated to the millimeter in the cramped space to avoid a broken arm from the recoiling steel. The 2-turreted Phantom shifts fire with mathematical precision. The deadly double taps leave no survivors. Side armor snaps under the kinetic hammer blows. A 4th vehicle ignites as its fuel tanks go up. A 5th takes a double hit to the engine and dies in a shroud of black smoke.
A 6th fires back blindly, sending HE shells over the trees, but the 7th volley from the Soviet monster silences its gun forever, punching through the radio operator's station. 7 enemy vehicles are burning iron coffins in a matter of minutes. The road is choked with flaming, twisted metal. Surviving infantry flee into the swamp, ditching their gear. They run from a ghost, a machine that shouldn't exist in any manual. Recoil normal. No movement. No more targets. Kolchin exhales, wiping his face with a torn sleeve. Right engine's boiling over, Sarge. The driver rasps, staring at the pegged gauges. The oil is thinning out, threatening to seize the pistons. 7 kills is an undeniable, ironclad argument. The bloody triumph of soldierly ingenuity over German steel is complete. Now, this wounded, overloaded machine has to make it back. The engines choke and sputter as they begin the trek back to where the terrified bureaucracy awaits a reckoning in the smoke of the fires. The reckoning begins in the thick smoke that the 2-headed monster drags behind it like a heavy shroud. The return to HQ looks like a slow crawl out of hell. The worn-out right engine makes a death rattle, the pistons hammering with a hideous clank. The punctured radiator vomits boiling antifreeze onto the engine deck. The overloaded torsion bars scream with every rotation. The crew isn't just driving. They are dragging 10 tons of battered steel on pure willpower. The 2-mile trek is a torture test for the chassis. Ground pressure is 50% over the limit. The steel tracks bite deep into the forest floor, leaving unnaturally deep, jagged ruts. The machine groans, but keeps crawling. The HQ clearing is no longer a realm of ink and regulations. It's a scene of organized, ringing panic. Major Bereznev stands on the porch of the log dugout, white-knuckling a field phone. His fingers tremble as he listens to reports of the shattered defense line.
And at that moment of peak bureaucratic despair, the condemned steel freak rolls out of the woods. The two faceted turrets are blackened with soot. The thin 45mm barrels are discolored from the heat. The driver cuts the ignition. A sudden silence drops over the clearing like a concrete block, broken only by the hiss of cooling oil and the clatter of empty brass casings falling from the floor hatch. Lieutenant Gromov drops from the hot armor onto the grass, his legs buckling from exhaustion and lack of oxygen. Behind him, Sergeant Major Kolchin climbs down, his bloody hands gripping the rails. Their faces are masks of powder, grease, and dried sweat. "Major, mission accomplished," Gromov rasps, his voice shot. He steps forward and leaves a greasy handprint on Bereznev's clean map case. "Enemy column destroyed. 7 kills on the Western Trail. The advance is stopped." The Major shifts his incredulous gaze from the grimy, bone-weary tankers to the mangled but still breathing tank. The dry frontline intelligence reports, just received over the radio, are already tearing through the HQ paperwork, more brutally than any armor-piercing round. Recon patrols confirm it beyond a doubt. 7 heavy German panzers are blazing in the clearing, an undeniable fact of a bloody triumph. "This vehicle is mechanically unsound. It was officially stricken from the rolls 2 hours ago," Bereznev repeats, his voice mechanical. But his tone lacks its former steely confidence. It is the broken voice of a man whose tidy paper universe just went up in smoke in the ruthless furnace of frontline reality. "That stricken war machine just punched 7 holes through alloyed Krupp steel," Kolchin cuts him off sharply, wiping acrid soot from his forehead with a rag. "The twin-linked fire with AP rounds works perfectly. 2 rifled barrels firing simultaneously provide the kinetic energy needed to shatter side plating. The chassis held up under the dynamic recoil." "I'm requesting you rescind the scrap order. We need an immediate ammo resupply, exactly 80 fixed rounds, and 3 buckets of cold well water for the boiling radiator." In this brief, forced breather, soldierly pride becomes physically tangible. It reeks of burnt rubber from the road wheels and the sour stench of sweat. The tanker's concussed eardrums continue to ring with a painful, high-frequency whine. Compressed lungs greedily gulp the clean forest air, reflexively purging accumulated carbon monoxide. The soulless, bureaucratic machine of command stutters, hitting an immovable object. Survival instinct and the ice-cold engineering grit of the NCOs prevail over the rigid paragraphs of regulations. Bereznev slowly pulls a yellowish slip from his breast pocket. It is the official Form 32 Write-Off Act. The very same goddamned document that, until moments ago, served as an absolute death sentence for this steel Frankenstein. The staff major silently, methodically tears the thick paper into tiny shreds. The scraps drift down into a muddy puddle trampled by combat boots. "Load a full combat rack," the officer snaps dryly, turning sharply toward the dugout. "Officially, this armored unit is temporarily attached to the lead battalion as a mobile firing point. The hard-won right to live has been seized in blood. Metal scarred by makeshift welding receives an official reprieve from the scrap heap. The exhausted crew collapses onto the damp grass beside the cooling tracks, their strength spent. The men sink into a leaden stupor. Their muscles burn with unbearable fire. Strained tendons ache from the extreme exertion. But this triumphant breather is merely a microscopic pause before hell truly breaks loose. The radio in the command dugout suddenly explodes with hysterical static. The operator screams frantically about a massive breakthrough by the main German Panzer Armada in the adjacent sector. The distant drone of hundreds of heavy, high-performance engines rapidly merges into a single, continuous roar that makes the ground tremble. The enemy is massing colossal reserves for a decisive blow. An inexorable judgment day is looming. The doomsday math of despair takes hold, and this lethal line already has a specific, dry topographic name on the maps. The crossroads at Krasny Yar. The crossroads at Krasny Yar was scoured from the topographic maps by heavy tube artillery 2 days ago. Now, it isn't a geographic location, but an exposed nerve in a ruptured defensive line, the perfect stage for a grand, ancient tragedy. The soot-blackened skeleton of a burnt army truck, a ditched field gun mangled by an explosion, and earth scarred by deep craters wait silently for fresh blood. The dull thud of countless leaden souls beats against eardrums. The earth doesn't just tremble, it thrashes in a continuous, nauseating fever. The physical sensation of the approaching catastrophe is transmitted through the thin soles of combat boots, through the metal tracks, and through the armor directly into the spinal cord. From the west, a solid, blind wall of clanking Krupp steel rolls forward. 50 heavy German tanks deploy into a wide wedge formation, methodically crushing the sparse screens of retreating Soviet infantry. War is a ruthless physics lab, where the basic animal instinct for self-preservation is completely cauterized by the cold necessity to kill. The math of despair here is brutally simple and devoid of mercy. 50 long-barreled enemy guns of 75 and 88 millimeters squared off against an absolutely naked rear area line. The twin-turreted Frankenstein, hastily topped off with murky water from a village well and packed to the gills with AP rounds, lumbers into a deep shell crater right in the center of the crossroads. The worn-out Gorky plant engines howl under the strain, struggling to push the 10-ton carcass, weighed down by an extra ton of unauthorized metal.
The overloaded running gear groans and creaks so loudly it sounds as if the glowing hot steel torsion bars are ready to snap from metal fatigue at any second. The ground pressure on the road wheels critically exceeds all factory tolerances. The machine locks into its chosen position, voluntarily turning into a stationary steel target. There is physically nowhere to retreat. Directly behind this line lie defenseless rear-area communications, medical convoys overflowing with wounded, and the main artillery ammunition dumps for the entire front. The air inside the cramped fighting compartment is heated to a critical limit. The suffocating stench of spilled motor oil, acrid sweat, and sour powder residue becomes almost tangible, settling as a bitter, nauseating metallic aftertaste on parched lips. The physiology of animal fear burned out long ago. Inside, only a ringing void remains, a concentration of will and mechanical reflexes hammered in by grueling drills. The concussed tankers have finally become a direct biological extension of the stiff steel levers and heavy breeches. Calloused palms, rubbed raw and bloody, grip the cold handles of the manual traverse gears. The crew's heart rates slow, instinctively syncing with the ragged, choking rhythm of the dying automobile engines. Through the static crackle in the headsets, the emotionless voice of the HQ radio operator breaks through. The poor-quality carbon mic ruthlessly distorts the sounds, turning them into a dry, procedural death sentence. 30, this is base. Detecting massive enemy armor movement in your grid. Estimated strength, up to 50 units. Command orders. Hold the line until reserves arrive. Withdrawal is strictly prohibited. Over. Sergeant Major Kolchin slowly presses the stiff button of his throat mic. His raspy voice sounds perfectly steady and matter-of-fact. It is the monotonous voice of a cold-blooded professional, fully accepting the inevitability of his imminent death as a simple task that brooks no argument. Base, this is 30. Visual contact with the enemy. Orders understood. Holding the line. Out. There isn't a single drop of reflection in those short, clipped military phrases. The crew thoroughly understands the lethal math of the coming fight. The Soviet light tank's frontal armor, only 35 millimeters thick, is like fragile window glass for a heavy German slug flying at over 1,000 meters per second.
If an 88mm flak-type AP shell hits that sloped frontal plate, the massive kinetic energy will punch through the cramped hull, instantly blow both makeshift turrets off their shattered rings, and turn the men inside into charred bone fragments mixed with burning, low-octane gasoline. Death in a tank has no face. It always has a very specific destructive caliber and the precise mass of the explosive filler in the shell. Through the narrow vision slits of mud-spattered periscopes, the tankers clearly see the first angular steel silhouettes emerging from the gray shroud of rising dust. Wide enemy tracks ruthlessly grind the parched earth into fine powder. The distance closes in rapid jerks. 800 meters, 700, 600. Time begins to compress inexorably, turning into a thick, heavy substance that pins down any unnecessary movement. Inside the scorching armored box, a dead silence reigns. This second lasts an eternity. Targeting, Kolchin dictates dryly, like a soulless metronome. Lead vehicle, bearing 11 o'clock. Range, 400 meters. AP rounds in both barrels. Wait for my command. Right gun loaded, the first loader rasps through a cough. Left gun loaded, the second echoes in perfect sync. The heavy breech blocks snap shut with a predatory metallic clang. The crew's ice-cold rage is securely encased in the thick armor of military discipline. The light 45mm guns can only punch through the thick hide of the monsters bearing down on them from point-blank, suicidal range by directing a double kinetic strike exactly into weakened zones. This isn't a classic tank battle. It's a desperate duel between a surgical scalpel and a blind, armored steamroller. The deadly steel avalanche approaches relentlessly. Dozens of long gun barrels slowly lower, feeling for the solitary target. A true firestorm is ready to break loose. The firestorm finally breaks loose when the first heavy German 88mm shell tears through the thick, soot-choked air over the Krasny Yar crossroads with a supersonic shriek. Hell doesn't begin with human screams. Hell begins with the deafening, ear-splitting crack of alloyed steel shattering. The reserve Soviet medium tanks that tried at the last second to cover the exposed flanks ignite instantly, like dry matches. The long-barreled German guns leave them absolutely no chance of survival. The monstrous kinetic energy of the heavy AP slugs punches through the tank's sloped armor, triggering immediate internal ammo rack detonations. Heavy, multi-ton turrets are blown off their rings with a dull howl and crash into the tank-trampled mud, spewing pillars of blinding yellow flame into the low sky. The lone, makeshift, twin-turreted monster is left absolutely alone against the encroaching, methodically clanking steel tide. A sudden seismic jolt from an incredibly close large-caliber HE shell blast lifts the 10-ton machine off the ground and slams it brutally back into the deep crater. Jagged, white-hot shrapnel shreds the thin armor of the engine compartment with a sickening whine. The two twin Gorky plant engines let out a final, agonizing metallic screech. Pierced radiators spit out a cloud of steam, worn pistons choke on boiling oil, and the motors go silent forever. The tank instantly becomes a completely stationary steel target, cemented into the clay of the crossroads. Maneuvering is no longer physically possible. Saving speed no longer exists.
Engines are dead! Crankcase is blown! Transmission's jammed!
The driver mechanic rasps frantically, spitting thick blood onto the steel floor littered with hot shell casings. The shockwave ruptured his eardrums.
Commander, are we burning? Bail out!
No evacuation. We're sitting in a kill box. Kolchin's voice sounds like a heavy sledgehammer hitting an anvil, cutting through the constant ringing of the concussion. Outside will be torn to shreds in a second. Load AP. Make every shot count. Aim for the lower glacis or the turret ring.
Range 300 meters. The battle immediately enters a stage of absolute physical catastrophe. The air inside the cramped armored box burns out completely within minutes. The weak stock fans are utterly useless. Thick, suffocating propellant fumes ruthlessly sear the mucous membranes of inflamed eyes and clog lungs with sticky, toxic soot. The temperature climbs past 140 degrees. The men breathe in short, ragged gasps, reflexively gulping the scorching, poisoned air. Every movement is hampered by monstrous, muscular fatigue. The loaders work on pure animal automation. Their palms, rubbed raw and bleeding, grip the heavy 45mm brass casings, slick with blood and acrid sweat. Right ready! Left ready! Doublet! Fire! The twin shot powerfully jolts the overloaded hull. 2 shells strike the vulnerable zone under a heavy German tank's turret in perfect sync. The enemy machine shudders, stops, and begins to slowly belch thick, black smoke. But the recoil from the continuous firing takes its toll. The makeshift welds on the right turret fail under the extreme dynamic load. The ring gear of the traverse mechanism lets out a sickening crunch of broken metal. The turret jams solid. Right ring's jammed! It won't budge! The loader screams, throwing his full weight against the immobile traverse handwheel.
The muscles in his strained back crack with the effort.
Crank it manually with the pry bar. Use the lever. Dig your feet in,
Kolchin roars, his eye glued to the rubber eyepiece of the telescopic sight.
Hold the left flank. Sight through the bore if you have to. We have no choice.
Outside, German medium-caliber AP slugs hammer methodically and terrifyingly against the sloped frontal armor. These dull, heavy thuds echo as a blunt pain directly inside the skull of every crew member. The ringing of ricochets merges into a single, continuous drone. The thin armor is covered in deep, glowing dents, but is holding against the glancing blows for now. The cold engineering calculation for the lowest possible silhouette miraculously saves them from a direct hit by a heavy, long-barreled gun whose thick shells whistle with a terrifying shriek just inches above the flat roofs of the jammed turrets. They cold-bloodedly turn the crossroads into a literal mass grave for enemy armor. A long half-track takes a shell directly in the engine compartment and flares up like a torch, deadlocking the narrow passage. Avoiding a collision with the burning wreck, the enemy vehicles are forced to expose their vulnerable thin flanks to aimed, point-blank fire. 3 more German tanks, one after another, lose their tracks, take hits to their fuel tanks, and turn into stationary bonfires. The mangled Soviet tank methodically vomits death. This is no longer tactics. It's a ruthless assembly line for processing human lives and metal. The crew works far beyond the physiological limit of muscular endurance. Men pass out from carbon monoxide, come to from the deafening roar of hits on the armor, and ram more shells into the breaches. But the supply of fixed rounds is not infinite. Hands feel for the last cold cylinders in the racks. The enemy armada begins to methodically flank the stationary steel monster, closing it in a tight, lethal ring. And at the moment the last shell slides into the breach with a dry, metallic clack, the blood-soaked earth of Krasny Yar suddenly begins to vibrate with a completely new, terrifying frequency. This terrifying vibration frequency does not belong to heavy German tracks. The sound rolls in inexorably from the east, making the shell-scarred, damp earth tremble in a completely different way. From behind a low hill, ruthlessly tearing through the thick veil of suffocating powder smoke, a column of Soviet heavy tank reserves rolls out. Powerful diesel engines roar at maximum RPM, drowning out the hollow boom of gunfire. Long-barreled 85mm guns immediately engage in a brutal meeting engagement,
The tightly organized crossfire from the fresh armored units instantly turns the rear enemy ranks into a flaming mess of mangled metal. The lethal ring around the wounded Frankenstein breaks with a loud crunch under the crushing kinetic blows of the breakthrough tanks. Heavy AP shells tear through the face-hardened Krupp steel of the flanking German panzers. Having lost their tactical advantage, the enemy hastily falls back, leaving their burning vehicles to be scavenged by the advancing infantry. "Cease fire!" Kolchin rasps, exhaustedly dropping his heavy, concussed head onto the scorching breech of the jammed gun. "Our boys are here. The line held." "No more shells, Sergeant Major. We're bone dry," the loader replies hollowly. He slides down the steel bulkhead onto the floor of the cramped fighting compartment, which is buried in spent brass casings. "Worked it down to the iron. The barrels are empty. Kill the engines, driver. Job's done." The tank battle rapidly moves further west, leaving behind only the dry crackle of burning diesel and the thick hiss of metal cooling on the ground. The crossroads at Krasny Yar is an absolute triumph of total destruction. The clay soil is literally encased in dead iron.
The twisted skeletons of multi-ton machines have deadlocked all the dirt access roads. In the very center of this cluster of wrecked armor, the twin-turreted monster stands motionless, pitch black from ingrained soot. Its twin 45mm rifled barrels are lowered. The worn-out twin automobile engines are dead forever. The mangled, makeshift running gear is completely destroyed by direct hits from large shrapnel and the extreme dynamic loads of the prolonged fight. The left side of the 35mm frontal armor is densely covered in deep, jagged craters from the glancing blows of German AP slugs. The dry mathematical data from the post-battle inspection looks like a blatant mockery of all the rigid academic laws of warfare. HQ field recon officers wander silently among the smoking wreckage, methodically and pedantically recording the results of the point-blank ambush fire. Exactly 23 destroyed enemy heavy tanks and half-tracks. 23 units of German armor stopped and burned by a single light machine condemned to the scrap heap. Simple Soviet AP rounds weighing just over 1.5 kilograms, fired in perfect sync from 2 guns, proved their total tactical superiority. The double kinetic strike completely shattered the usual patterns. The math of death added up in favor of those tankers who daringly refused to blindly obey the HQ instructions of Form 32. The rescue team from the Rear Area Repair Battalion arrives and, with great effort, pries open the turret hatches, jammed by direct hits, using heavy steel pry bars. The crew is extracted from the tank's scorching bowels in a state of deep shock and severe oxygen deprivation. The tankers' faces are covered in a thick black crust of powder soot. Their faded tunics are soaked through with sticky blood from ruptured eardrums and acrid sweat. There are absolutely no loud shouts of joy here, no empty slogans or celebratory embraces. The exhausted men simply lie on their backs on the cratered earth and stare silently at the gray sky. The physiological limit of human capability was passed long ago. War bypassed the crew on this specific day, but it permanently drained the last of their physical strength. The bitter price of survival on the front line is measured in blown backs, torn ligaments, and ruined health. Completely destroyed from within, but undefeated, the war machine remains forever at the shattered crossroads. It turns into a silent steel monument to human tenacity. Bureaucratic agencies in distant rear area HQs will exchange dry circulars for a long time, desperately trying to fit this impossible combat episode into the rigid framework of Army regulations. However, frontline soldierly memory
has no need for round stamps or ink signatures from high-ranking bosses. The harsh truth is passed from one tank crew to another, extremely dry, hard, and without the slightest embellishment. The engineering genius born of despair and the greasy grime of a field repair battalion undeniably proved its right to a long life. The audacity of a professional armed with a simple wrench, a sledgehammer, and ice-cold calculation is capable of physically crushing any enemy armada. Military mechanisms inevitably rust and are sent to open hearth furnaces to be melted down. But engineering grit and steely will remain that insurmountable line against which all foreign plans of conquest will always shatter. It is the only real law of survival, an absolutely hard, undeniable final point in the bloody history of one impossible machine.